Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us for our virtual conversation today with U.S. Deputy Secretary of Energy, David Turk, and the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Dr. Fatih Birol. I'm Landon Darrence, and I am the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. We're very excited to dig into COP28 on the horizon here and how we can continue to advance the energy transition. We're obviously only weeks away on the cusp of COP28, the UN's premier climate conference. And I believe it's fair to say that this year will bring a formative role for energy at the forefront of dialogue as we set the trajectory of the global energy transition and global mitigation strategies. It's particularly an opportunity for the energy industry to demonstrate its commitments to meeting global climate change. And we're excited to dive into this conversation. Prioritizing decarbonization efforts and the energy transition action by energy industries and global actors is critical if we're going to meet our Paris objectives. And there's no better guest to join us and dive into these issues than the Deputy Secretary and Dr. Birol. So very excited to have you both with us today. Deputy Secretary Turk, why don't we start with you and thinking about the U.S. Department of Energy's objectives for COP28? What are the headlines that you're hoping to be reading from Dubai, and how do these align with DOE's objectives and global outcomes expected from the event?
Well, first of all, Landon, let me just say what it's a pleasure to be with you. You used to work, as you know, back at the U.S. Department of Energy, so it always gives me a little pain to see you in Atlantic Council or other kind of settings, but it's terrific to be with you, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with my former boss and good friend and mentor, Fatih Birol, who is just such a treasure for all of us on the energy and the clean energy front, and our IEA colleagues in particular. So my thoughts on the COP, I'm hoping there's an awful lot of focus at this climate conference on what's actually happening out there in the real world. This is my training with Fatih to look at the numbers and actually see what's happening out there on EVs, on solar PV, on all these clean energy technologies. For those who've not had a chance to look yet, and I suspect many of our viewers, maybe all our viewers already have, is taking a look at the IEA's latest numbers. And we are seeing some really significant positive progress over the last few years. I think the WIO had it that back in 2020, 1 in 25 cars sold in the world was an EV. This latest year in 2023, 1 in 5. So we've gone from 1 in 25 to 1 in 5. That's a huge progress over a very short period of time. In the US, our latest EV numbers are 10%. Of our cars sold are now EVs. Now, that's not as high as in Europe and some other places, but we're making very significant progress, including under President Biden's leadership to build out our EV charging infrastructure. 500 gigawatts of renewable generation capacity set to be added in 2023. That is a huge amount globally. So the first headline I'd like to see at the COP, or a series of headlines, is how are we doing in the real world? Where are we making progress with certain technologies in certain areas? And where do we need to do more? This is the global stock take year, so it is appropriate to take a step back, see what the numbers are saying, and see what more we need to focus on. I also hope that there's an awful lot of discussion and focus on a race to the top phenomena, which we've not seen at previous COP so much. The fact that the US government is doing so much, and happy to get into what we're doing under the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the billions of investment that we're making, the tax incentives, 10-year tax incentives. I know that caused a lot of other countries to step up even further on what they're doing domestically. And that kind of race to the top, friendly competition, I think, is how we get to the scale of investment that Fatih and his colleagues have talked about for years and years of being necessary on the clean energy front. So my hope is there's a real discussion and focus on how we have that phenomena going forward.
Dr. Birol, the Deputy Secretary is acknowledging, obviously, the global stock take, but also IEA's prowess and playing a formative role in evaluating the trajectory of global energy and climate progress through the analysis that the International Energy Agency engages in. What's your assessment of where we're at, and do you see an ability for this race to the top that the Deputy Secretary is calling for?
So many thanks for inviting me, and I have the pleasure and a privilege to be with Mr. Deputy Secretary in this discussion. So, Landon, when I woke up this morning in Paris, we are in Paris, you are in Washington, it is now late in the afternoon, very early in the morning. I get up early. Dave knows very well from the emails I sent when we were working directly together. I got a very good news, a news that I was hoping to get since a long time, namely US and China have enhanced cooperation on climate change on many fronts. They have committed, coming from California, that ranging from renewables to methane emissions, to from methane to CCS, energy efficiency. This is excellent news. This is excellent news, and it's a sign of commitment that the countries, two largest economies of the world, will work together and hopefully make build a important cooperation between these two countries, which help to have a better international collaboration towards COP28. Remember the previous major COP meeting in Paris, 2015, the building block of that Paris successful agreement was at that time President Obama traveled to China, to Beijing, to visit the Chinese president, had an agreement, and this was the building block for the Paris 2015 agreement. And I hope this time this enhanced cooperation between these two largest economies will serve the same purpose. Now, it's a good news, but there is also, of course, when we look at the numbers, which we do at the IEA, there are some worrying numbers. Some of them are really worrying, which means that the CO2 emissions this year will reach a record high, and 2023, this year that we are in, will be 99.9% the hottest year recorded in the history, with the record number of extreme weather events, both in terms of their intensity and in terms of their frequency. These are really worrying trends. But on the clean energy front, we see also a big change. Our World Energy Outlook says, even with the current policies, even there are no new climate policies, clean energy policies are deployed by the governments, even with the current policy context, in 2030, global energy picture will be very different than we have today. For example, they mentioned the electric cars. Every second car sold in 2030 will be an electric car. Between now and 2030, more than 80% of all new power capacity will come from renewables, and also about 5 to 6% from nuclear power. So almost close to 90% from clean energy. Heat pumps sales are growing so strongly that they are overtaking the sales of fossil fuel boilers. Investment, clean energy investment, when you look at them, it's really growing very rapidly. From in the last 2 years, the global all energy investment increased from 2 trillion to 2.8 trillion in 2 years of time. All energy, coal, oil, gas, from 2 trillion to 2.8 trillion, and all the increase came from the clean energy investments. So these are encouraging trends. We are, as a result of that, Landon, we are seeing that even with the current policies, the fossil fuel demand will peak within this decade. Coal, followed by oil, then gas. Of course, the issues post-peak, what kind of decline trajectory? Is it fast enough to bring us to 1.5 degrees or not? With the current policies, even as we see, there is a peak before 2030, we are in line with a temperature increase of 2.4 degrees Celsius, much higher than 1.5. But there is some strong growth in clean energy. To finish, in my view, clean energy is moving fast and faster than many people realize. And I hope COP will give to governments, to markets, a strong signal that this trend will even accelerate in the future, especially in the developing countries.
Dr. Birol, if we could, let's dive into these numbers and talk about how to translate that data into impact and announcements at COP28. You know, the IEA has hosted a series of high-level dialogues, including with COP28 President-designate Dr. Sultan. You've had the International Energy and Climate Summit co-hosted with Spain and its role as EU presidency. What are your takeaways from these events, and how do we take and use the COP to marshal the outcomes that you're talking about that are on a longer horizon?
So what we have done is with Dr. Sultan, 4 high-level dialogues, bringing maybe altogether over 50 ministers, stakeholders, the energy industry, the investors, NGOs. One of the meeting was in the context of G20 in India. The other one was the African Climate Summit in that context in Nairobi. The other one in New York in the context of UN General Assembly. And in fact, the last one was only 2 hours ago. It just finished. What I see is that there is a convergence on certain areas. One of them is the renewables, the tripling of the renewable capacity and doubling of energy efficiency. These are 2 areas, 2 outcomes coming from the IEA World Energy Outlook. Now, this is accepted, we see in these discussions from many countries. There are 2 areas that are still under discussion. How to deal with the fossil fuel we have now, because renewables increase doesn't mean that automatically fossil fuels will decline as much as we would like to see. So fossil fuel, how to address the fossil fuel issue. The other one is the financing of clean energy in developing countries. These are the 2 areas that still needs discussion. And for this, I would think that the most important leverage we have in hand is the international collaboration between the countries. And once again, it was a very good news today that the US and China show that they would like to see a strong outcome from COP28. It made me even more hopeful from COP28. Of course, we will see what happens, but it gave some hope, at least this morning, to me.
Well, Deputy Secretary Turk, I want to build on Fatih's comments here. Obviously, you know, President Biden isn't waiting for COP to start to make announcements. Great news in the bilateral relationship with China. DOE is also not waiting to make announcements. I saw overnight you had a $444 million announcement about carbon capture and storage, and that just builds on a whole series of major announcements in the clean energy space that you've been pursuing at the Department of Energy. You know, are you also looking for any particularly impactful announcements as we congregate global leaders together in Dubai?
Well, thanks, Landon. And it's kind of shocking how often we have billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars of announcements. A few weeks ago, we had $7 billion for our clean hydrogen hubs to really stimulate that part of the economy. A few weeks ago, we had several billion going out for grid resilience. You mentioned the carbon capture storage amounts. We've had a couple billion for direct air capture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It ends up being our department alone through the historic pieces of legislation under President Biden's leadership gave us $100 billion just shy of in a variety of grant programs and rebates to do exactly what Fatih's talking about on heat pumps and EVs and you name it. with a lot of cost reduction going to consumers in the US as well, which is a huge, huge benefit also. So there's a number of announcements that we're doing regularly, other countries, of course, as well. I guess a few that I'd flag for you in particular, I think the tripling renewables capacity by 2030 is a big deal, and the doubling of energy efficiency. It's no surprise to me that Fatih and our IEA colleagues' fingerprints are all over those in terms of analysis, in terms of all the conferences, and those are incredibly important, incredibly inspiring to keep the momentum that we have, to build the momentum that we have. Because as Fatih says, we are not on track. We're not on track right now, as much as we are making some progress in certain areas. One area I know it'll get a lot of discussion at the COP, rightfully so, and more generally, it needs to get a lot of discussion, is how much of this clean energy investment is actually happening in developing countries around the world. The short answer in Fatih's efforts and his colleagues on the World Energy Investment Analysis is too little of that is happening in the developing world. We're trying to work through the Department of Energy through something called Net Zero World with key emerging economies to try to make sure that as much of that investment can happen for the benefit of people living in the emerging world. And so we think that that is an incredibly important area to focus on. I also appreciate, I have to say, Fatih and Landon, you as well. And I really want to give a lot of credit to Secretary Kerry, obviously President Biden, but Secretary Kerry in particular for all his diligence, time and time again, working on the China front, reaching the deal that we did get, which I think is a big deal, although there's a lot more work that we need to do. There's a lot more work that China needs to do as well, not just for 2035, but 2030, there's still more work that can be done and should be done through the NDC process on that front. I think there'll be a lot of focus on the oil and gas industry in particular. And I think there's an opportunity for some companies to step up in a big way and for there to be a really honest, candid conversation about where we need to go forward on that front. Oil and gas companies, I think, have a special responsibility on the climate front. First of all, an awful lot of the global emissions right now are coming from the oil and gas industry and the products that the oil and gas industry produces. I think the latest number I saw was 63% of the world's annual energy-related CO2 emissions come from the oil and gas industry, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. These companies also have phenomenal human talent, logistics talent, the ability to really lean in and be such a helpful part of the clean energy front. So I know there'll be a lot of focus, a lot of discussion on what that means. My hope is there's not just a discussion and a focus on scope 1 and scope 2, but an awful lot of discussion on scope 3. That is the products from the oil and gas industry. In fact, if you look at where the emissions are coming from, an estimate I saw recently is 10 times the amount of emissions for scope 3 as scope 1 and scope 2 combined. So my hope is there's a focus on scope 3 in oil and gas, as there's also, rightfully so, an opportunity for oil and gas industry to step up on methane emissions and really send some incredibly strong signals and action on that front. And again, Fatih and our IEA colleagues have been very focused on that, as we have in the US as well. But I hope there's a real focus on the scope 3 emissions as well.
Dr. Birol, you raised fossil energy as well. And I think it's safe to say when you have a COP in the Middle East in general, but also when you put, your COP28 president designate is among many hats, also the CEO of the national oil company, that there's going to be an emphasis on fossil energy and a need and expectation to see transformation of that sector. What do you see as the sector's role in this COP, and how do you constructively engage, as Deputy Secretary Turk points out, a community that does have a lot of human capital and talent and resources to bring to bear?
No, I agree everything what Deputy Secretary said. Really, both scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are extremely important. Is just to give you how important it is. Scope 1, scope 2 emissions. If you put the scope 3 aside for a moment, from the oil and gas industry is, in fact, not difficult to eliminate. And it is a big one. It's about 15% of all global emissions, which is more or less equal to the all emissions of United States, total emissions of United States. and the scope 1, scope 2 emissions of the oil and gas industry more or less equal. And this is since years, there is not any real improvement there. So for me, in general, if I may, we discuss with oil and gas industry very closely both the IOCs, NOCs. When I say IOCs, the ones in North America, ones in Europe and elsewhere, but also with the NOCs in Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. For me, when I talk with the business leaders of the oil and gas industry, they say that they would like to address the issue of climate change. Up to now, nobody told me that they don't care about climate change. This is very good, what they say. But I would like to see what they say and what they do, or at least there's a parallel, if not the same thing. Now, if an oil company says, in the next 10 years, I am going to increase my oil production by several million barrels per day, I can say that this is the company's strategy. I understand that they want to put their money in oil. This is okay. But, big but, if they at the same time say, my company's strategy is in line with the Paris climate goals, at the same time in the speech, this doesn't work. They have to choose one of them. Because we expect that even with the existing policies, without additional clean energy policies, global oil demand will peak before 2030. And to bring millions of barrels of new oil or coal or gas to the markets is, in my view, nothing to do with the company having a strategy in line with the climate goals. So for me, we have been this discussion since several years with the oil and gas industry, not only us, but everybody. And this is the COP28 is the moment of truth for the oil and gas industry. We will see what they are going to commit and what they are going to avoid to commit. And I am very much looking forward to discuss with the business leaders of oil and gas industry in COP. And I am very much looking forward to see what kind of commitments they are going to make and how these commitments will be translated into their capital expenditures and their business strategies.
You know, over the course of this year, we've had a lot of engagement on this issue. And there's one area of some confluence, which is on the methane side, and this concept that I think the Emiratis and the COP28 presidency are pursuing, which is near zero methane 2030. It's an area where the technology is mature. There seems to be reasonable finance. Dr. Birol, you put out a report on this issue, noting how much progress can be made in the methane front with industry and how big of an impact that can have on such a potent greenhouse gas. Is there anything that you could specifically expect from industry in this space? Because a lot of the oil and gas content can be a little bit controversial, or there's not as much continuity of opinions. And I think near zero methane is one area where industry, civil society, the climate community are really moving together as they think through these issues. What's your expectation on methane?
I have really this COP. I have high expectations, especially again. I sorry to come back, but yesterday's announcement, because it is one of the areas of the China and the United States agree to make a substantial cut on methane emissions. So the importance of methane is the following: we can reduce the methane much more faster than CO2 emissions, because these are all venting and flaring or leaking. It is more or less a plumber type of job. And many of the, more than half of the methane emissions can be minimized, if not nullified, at zero cost, very cost effective. So therefore, I have high expectations, and from COP28, and I see that in fact, the oil and gas industry, there is a convergence in many NOCs and IOCs today that we discuss. They are ready. They say they are ready to commit themselves to a radical or substantial reduction in methane emissions. We would like to see at least oil and gas industry commit itself to 75% of a reduction of methane. This would bring us to gain some time for to deal with the hard to abate sectors in the reducing the emissions. So this is therefore extremely important, vital to reduce methane.
Well, I have to say, let's get the methane quote plumbers to work, and I'm excited about this. But I do want to bring our conversation back to the clean energy deployment side. And of course, COP28 is just one touch point in the conversation of the global climate crisis. And I think addressing climate change requires an enduring commitment of change. Deputy Secretary Turk, it's been well over a year since passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. You talked about some of the scale of investment and the dollars that are being deployed just by your department with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act. Can you share your perspective in terms of the impact and scale of what this legislation has done in the United States and globally, and of course, how we then bring this to bear in concert with other international partners in forums like COP, but frankly, even enduring past COP?
Yeah, thanks, Landon. And maybe if I could just a word on methane and more broadly on the oil and gas, because I think it will get so much attention, that industry in particular at this COP. First, on the methane side, to me, this is the biggest no-brainer that's been sitting out there, right, for an awful lot more action by the oil and gas industry in particular, but other industries as well. And it's nice to see a convergence, and I think we really do have an opportunity at this COP and at this particular moment in time. And it's not only doing the plumbing on your own operations and having the transparency and independent verification of that, which I think more and more companies are embracing and should be embracing, frankly. But there's also an opportunity, I think, including from the industry side, to recognize that it's not just leaks that are happening in developed countries, but in developing countries as well. And there may be an opportunity here for oil and gas companies and others like the US, other countries to step up, to try to help in emerging economies to get methane emission reductions along the lines Fatih's talked about more broadly. So I'm hopeful that there's a real opportunity there. On the oil and gas industry, and maybe more generally, again, maybe this is my training, the IEA, but really looking at the data and looking at the numbers, including following the money kind of piece to it. I think that's how you can tell if an industry or a company, or frankly, a government is really focused on what needs to happen on that end. On scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, I think we will see some real progress in the oil and gas industry side of things. Those are not insignificant emissions, just as Fatih has laid out. But if you follow the money and follow the opportunity space there, I think it was IEA who said just 15% of the fossil fuel industry's windfall net income from last year could finance the entire industry cutting their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions intensity in half by 2030. So the amount of money is available to do the scope 1, to do the scope 2, the significant reductions that are being talked about that the UAE COP presidency is focused on. But I think it's also important to follow the money again on scope 3. If scope 3 emissions for the oil and gas industry are 10 times the number, the amount of scope 1 and scope 2 combined on average, some companies a little bit more than that, some companies a little bit less than that, we've got to essentially focus on scope 3 emissions as well. And I think there's an opportunity to follow the money on where investments are being made, especially with the IEA's latest analysis that it's not only coal, it's not only oil, but it's natural gas that will be peaking by 2030. That's remarkable progress in terms of emissions. But let's really hold the industry accountable for following the money. What investments are they making going forward in terms of the clean energy transition? I also think it's important to follow the money on the lobbying side of things as well. These are incredibly important actors within the US political system, but other political systems around the world. And where are they putting their lobbying support behind the kinds of policies that allow us all to move forward to reach the climate objectives we absolutely need to reach going forward. All right, sorry to digress a little bit, Landon. Couldn't help myself.
No, it's great. It's great.
Help myself, but to answer your question directly, so we just recently celebrated the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act's passage, the year anniversary. And today we're actually celebrating the 2-year anniversary of the other piece of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. These two bills combined are the biggest thing to happen, certainly for climate change efforts, clean energy transition efforts in the US government. And I would argue, and I think Fatih's been out there as well, saying what a big deal this is on the international scene as well, given the size and scale of the US economy, given the innovation ability of the US economy, our ability to lower costs by doing things at scale that have benefits around the world. So the tax credit part of this is a huge piece. It's tax credits across the board. It's tax credits for manufacturing. It's tax credits for deployment. And these are 10-year tax credits with certainty for that 10-year period of time, which allows industry, allows investors to really unleash the benefits of these clean energy technologies. But it's also $100 billion, as I was mentioning earlier, just at the Department of Energy for all sorts of grant programs to complement those tax credit programs. We're also reinvigorating like never before our loan program, which was responsible for a loan early on in Tesla's days that got Tesla up and running and becoming the company that it is today. We're trying to do that with a variety of other companies, not just in the automotive and battery space, but virtual power plants. We had one of our loans go out for virtual power plants, which I think are such an incredibly important part of the equation. So we're doing things at scale. And what's particularly pleasing to me, and I think there should get a good bit of discussion at the climate conference this year, is we're making sure that as we make these investments in the US, they're not only benefiting the clean energy transition and saving the planet. That's important. That's incredibly important. Many of us have made our careers focused on that effort. But we also have to save our communities at the same time. So with all our grant money that goes out the door, we have a requirement for a community benefits plan to make sure that this money is actually benefiting the communities in which that investment in a battery manufacturing facility will take place, or that community solar, or that virtual power plant, to make sure that these investments benefit the people, real people's lives and real communities across our country. You can call it just transition, you can call it doing the right thing, both morally, but I'd say also the right thing economically. And that's one of the biggest, I think, the tools in the tool belt we have on that front are just immense. So my hope is that's inspirational. There's a friendly competition. Other countries do more, and then we do more from the US side, and other countries do more. And we're able to do things at the pace and scale we need to, frankly, across the board to get on track to our overall global climate goals.
Well, Dr. Birol, let's talk about doing this in concert with our friends and partners. The IEA represents, I'm going to say, approximately 40 countries when you think of members and associate countries. I'm sure it's a few more, but just an approximation there. How do we deploy policy as the United States has at scale and effectively bring along this effort together to realize both the emissions trajectory we're looking for, but I think a really important point brought up by Deputy Secretary Turk, which is that this is lifting up people and the lives and livelihoods of individuals as we experience this energy transition together.
Now, just one point I would like to mention when it comes to United States and going to the rest of the world, the community benefit plan of the United States, the US government, is something extremely important to have the people behind the clean energy transition rather than people in the streets see it as a barrier. If you make the community benefit from the advantages of the clean energy transition, if they really benefit, they will be supporters of the clean energy transition, which is in turn being done for them, for the people. But therefore, it is very well thought, very well designed, the community benefit plan, and our kudos to our colleagues in the US government, especially with the DOE. Now, globally, my worry is the following. I mentioned the clean energy investment is growing, but it is growing mainly, if not exclusively, in the rich countries and China. There is also the rest of the world, which is the Asia, which is Africa, which is Latin America. It is when we look at the clean energy investment trends, it is more or less flat. For me, the fault line of our fight against climate change is how do we finance clean energy investments in the developing world? Because you have more sun in Africa than anywhere else, but the cost of capital in Africa for solar is 3 times higher than Europe. Can you believe it? In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, every second person doesn't have access to electricity. Africa has the largest potential of the solar in the world by far, and yet the electricity generated from solar power in Africa today is half of the solar power generated in Netherlands. Think about the Netherlands in the global map, how big Netherlands is, and the entire Africa. Africa solar electricity generation is half of Netherlands. I think this is a real human drama. And in Africa, you don't have, 50% of the population have no access to electricity. So therefore, we have to find ways to bring the cost of capital down, de-risk the investments in the emerging countries. The international financial institutions need to play a pivotal role here, and taking the clean energy as a key priority for their money lending programs. And London, I would say, when we go to COP28, for me, this is the most important challenge. And for United States, for Europe, for Japan, for many, Canada and the others, it is very important to approach the challenges of developing countries with empathy, so that it doesn't create a fertile ground for some other countries to make divides between the countries I mentioned and the advanced economies. So it is important that we give our hand to those countries, which is good for us as well, because 1 ton of emissions going to atmosphere from Detroit or from Jakarta has the same effect on the people in Washington or in New York. Emissions don't have a passport. So even from the point of view of the climate change, it makes sense. From the point of view of the geopolitical context, it makes sense. And from being a good human beings, it makes sense, in my view, to look at this issue.
So Deputy Secretary Turk, you mentioned your motivation to see the clean energy deployment, the 3x of clean energy deployed in the developing world as well. Do you see the policies in the United States successfully now translating to the developing world? I mean, how do we bridge the gap? There's a lot of money going into the U.S. economy for clean energy deployment. How do we now bring that and have that empathy, or at least sympathy with continents like Africa, where energy access is such a hard thing to come by?
Well, I think it's empathy, it's sympathy, but it's action, and really making some tangible, real progress on this front. The numbers are stark, and we're just not doing good enough. And there's a huge opportunity space for clean energy to benefit these communities, benefit real people's lives. And I think there's a huge opportunity as we think of the global clean energy supply chains. A country like the US, but you look at other big countries around the world, we're going to need an awful lot of clean energy supply chain. And that has a huge economic opportunity, not only for us in our own country in the US, but I think around the world, especially for those countries who have human rights standards, who have democracy, who have transparency, including a lot of developing countries. And so I know when I've traveled in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia, I think there's a huge opportunity to work in partnership to try to leverage the World Bank, leverage regional development banks, leverage EFC, leverage XM, leverage a lot of other institutions, not just in the US, in other countries around the world, not only for the benefit of the diversified global clean energy supply chain in a way that's good for everyone's energy security, but also in a way that allows these countries to move up the value chain, right? Many countries are blessed with lithium and other resources, critical minerals that we'll need. Great for those countries and those people in those countries to benefit from those resources. Even better from my perspective, if they move up the value chain and they get increased economic opportunity from those resources. That's going to take an awful lot of true partnership, countries really working with others, working with the private sector, working with regional development banks and the World Bank and others to try to capture those benefits. So I think the numbers are what the numbers are. We're making some progress, but as Fatih says, we need to make an awful lot of progress, more progress going forward. And we're not going to solve climate change from a mitigation perspective unless we do so. But there's also a huge amount of need for adaptation and resilience around the world as well. So I know this is a huge, huge priority for us in the US government. We need to do more. Others need to do more. We really need to step up on that front.
Well, as vibrant of a conversation as it's been, unfortunately, our time is drawing pretty close to an end here. And, I love just to wrap up with bringing it back to COP28, bringing it back to advancing the clean energy agenda in Dubai. So a final question for both of you. We'll start with Dr. Birol. From your perspective, what is the overall best outcome for COP28?
I have many things I would like to see, but one thing I would like to see is the governments around the world, if not all of them, a big majority of them give an unmistakable signal to the markets around the world, the economic markets, energy markets, that they are going to accelerate the clean energy transition in a big way so that we are going to reach our climate targets. So I need this unmistakable political signal coming from the majority of the governments around the world and the energy industry playing a positive role to make this happen. So this is the unmistakable signal, is the what I would like to get from COP28 in Dubai.
Deputy Secretary Turk.
So couldn't agree more with Fatih on the importance of that signal, not only coming from countries and country leaders, but also from the private sector as well. The tripling of renewables, the doubling of energy efficiency, those are huge signals in and of themselves. The obviously nationally determined contributions and what countries put more on the table to meet the gap that's out there. I also think it's incredibly important to appreciate that that kind of political signal is so important, but we're going to win or lose the global effort on climate change to reduce climate change through day in and day out, people making career choices. We've now got 800 people newly to the US Department of Energy who've joined our Clean Energy Corps to administer all of these grant programs and trying to get the most out of these dollars for real world impact. It's inspirational to meet with those colleagues, many of whom are earning an awful lot more out in the private sector, who've come into government, public service, to step up, design these programs, and take advantage of this historic opportunity in the US. I've had a chance to meet with entrepreneurs and other business leaders, nonprofits, others who are stepping up, making a career to really day in and day out advance the cause here. So we need the political signal. COPs and other conferences are incredibly important for that, but we also need all the real world execution, the transparency, looking at the numbers, being honest with ourselves, following the numbers to make sure that we achieve this in the real world, because that's what we're after in the end.
Well, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure. Dr. Birol, Deputy Secretary Turk, I really appreciate you joining us for this conversation today. We will see you, the Atlantic Council will see you in Dubai, where we're hosting the Global Energy Forum and an Energy Connect Pavilion in concert with the COP28 Energy Transition Team. Stop by. We'd love to host you. But really appreciate you bringing this conversation together. And while we know that we're going to be addressing the global stock take and that the results of that are sobering and insufficient to achieve our climate action, I really love this idea of real world execution and action. Let's hold people accountable and get to work. So thank you very much for joining us, and see you in Dubai.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dave. Very nice to see you. Thank you very much, Landon. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.